Hi, huggers! Coming at you with another one of my fabulous videos. Um, Actually, this one's kind of important. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the skills. Now, I know that I've mentioned them on the periphery, but I think it's important that we spend some time talking about the skills because since you only have FRQs to write, the skills are going to be critically important to your success. And so what I want to do is I want to first show you this again so you can see that there are 5 different skill categories: concepts and processes, spatial relationships, data analysis, and source analysis are actually the same learning targets if you're looking at like the brown and the yellow right now. The only thing that's different is the type of source that you're analyzing. With data, it's charts, tables, graphs, satellite images, etc., maps on both source and data. And then on the other side, with source analysis, you're looking at satellites, photographs, landscape, images of landscapes, and so on and so forth. And then finally, the last category is skill category 5 is scale analysis. So my thinking is that we're going to focus on one of these skill categories per week until the end of the review time until we get to the test. So we're going to start this week with skill category 1. 2 will be next week. I'm going to combine 3 and 4 the following week, and then we'll end with our I don't know why this seems to be our arch nemesis. Maybe it's just me, but skill category 5 is scale analysis, and we'll end with that. When you're looking at concept and processes, this is really your content skill. So this is the one that's probably going to be the easiest, I think, because you're not really doing that much. I mean, this is going to be where those of you that are good at memorizing the concepts will do very well on these skills. But it's important that you pay attention to those task verbs: describe, explain, compare, describe, explain. Notice how there's very few identify and defines. If you're just kind of perusing this slide right now as I'm talking, I mean, there's like just very few. So I think the FRQs are probably going to mimic that as well. So let's talk a little bit in more detail about skill category 1, and I'm going to walk you through 1A through 1E. This would be a good opportunity too, if you guys are watching this, and I'll explain. If you had seen the last video, you'll understand the expectations for this video. But if you do have questions over any parts of the video, that would be a good thing for you to jot down and then bring to those meetings when we do discussion about whatever you want, really, but also related to content. Okay, so skill category 1A is to describe geographic concepts, process, models, and theories. And so it's really important that you understand what describe means. So here, describe means to provide relevant, specific qualities, characteristics, and events. Of the higher level task verbs, describe is the easiest. Explain and compare are much more complicated in terms of their level of thinking that you're required to do as you take on that verb. So when you think about describe, if we're applying this to ourselves, describe would be, how do you describe yourself? How would your best friend describe you? How would your mom or dad describe you? How I describe myself is very different than how my parents describe me. If you were to ask my mom to describe me, she would say that I was stubborn and hard-headed and argumentative. I don't think of myself like that. I think those are just the qualities that my mom brings out in me. But maybe we have a little bit of all of these characteristics as a part of ourselves. Hopefully you guys are laughing at that. It's kind of a joke, kind of not a joke at the same time. So when we're looking at describe as it relates to geography or this class, you can see that there are a lot of examples of things that you could describe. And remember, you're not explaining this, you're just talking about what it is that you're seeing, right? Again, I'll go back. What are the qualities, the characteristics, and or the events? What are the things that are relative to our understanding of this? So if you're describing, for example, the von Thunen model, you are just telling me what the model is, right? It is 5 circles that illustrate where agriculture might be grown based on the bid rent theory, where the land closest to the center of the circle is the most expensive. Therefore, you're going to plant your most perishable goods there, or the goods that don't travel as well, versus the last tropical, which is where the land is least expensive, and those crops that need more land and are easier to transport are most likely going to be located out in that area. I think I might have done a little accidental explaining in there too, but really, when it comes to describe, look at the model, tell me what you see. That's it. Explain is obviously a little hard for me to differentiate because I kind of think and describe and explain at the same time. But explain means to tell how or why. So when you're being asked to explain geographic concepts, process, models, and theories, you should take your description maybe a step further and add to your explanation the idea of how or why. So a good test to make sure that you're explaining means that you're including the word because. So some relevant to you examples. A says, explain why your parents would not let you go out with your friends. Why would they not let you? Because. Explain why you earned a low or high grade on assessment. Why? Because. So for that second letter, I might say something like, I earned an A on my test after studying for the last week and doing reviews and so on and so forth, because grades are really important to me. And I know that when I put effort forth in completing or I don't know, studying for an exam, whatever it might be, that I will get a good grade, something along those lines. And so when you're doing this, again, when you're doing this for geography, this idea of telling how or why a process occurs is what you're thinking about, or what you should be thinking about. So letter A says, explain some ways that a minority language can preserve at least some of their linguistic characteristics. You might want to talk about the importance of isolation, thinking about this in terms of folk culture or indigenous culture is probably a better way to look at it. You would talk about why that would actually help preserve languages. So when an indigenous language is isolated, that they do that isolation, or they engage in isolation because they're trying to remove any of the elements of diffusion that might in some way change their language, or they're trying to avoid assimilation because they want to preserve their language, or something along those lines. Explain some ways in which minority cultural landscapes are being protected. This would probably be, you would probably talk about in some ways the way that governments get involved in order to protect cultural landscapes, because it's important to maintain a culture's individual characteristics, to avoid placelessness, etc., whatever it might be. Explain the concept of geographic region. So it's not just describing it like, hey, here's a perceptual region, but this is the reason why a perceptual region exists, because people are fuzzy about where the lines actually are, for example, the South, etc. You get the gist. Okay, so telling how or why, including the word because as you're explaining whatever it is that you're explaining, is really the best way to ensure that you're doing that task verb justice. Okay, 1C asks you to compare geographic concepts, process, models, and theories. And after spending a year practicing this skill, I think you guys have it. So I'm just going to go over this one real quickly. So when a student is being asked to compare, they're being asked for a description and an explanation of a similarity and or difference. In the world of human geos, some would argue that this is actually the most challenging task verb, because you can see that you have elements of both describe and explain right here. And then I just accidentally popped those on. So students are being asked to write about two separate items, therefore two-part answer to the question is needed. I know you guys know this. You can't just talk about one thing. You have to talk about both things when you're being asked to compare. A helpful hint for this is practice using transition words or phrases. So you might say something about one thing, and then you would say, however, therefore, nonetheless, or on the other hand, and then you can ensure the fact that you're going to talk about the other thing that you're being asked to compare. And I just mentioned this before, but you can see that it's really important when you're doing this well to describe and then explain in the definition of compare. Okay, so like here's an example. So compare the dependency ratios of Uganda and Japan. And you may not be thinking that you're doing this, but you really are describing. Like, for example, you're looking at Uganda And you can tell that Uganda has a dependency ratio where they're high dependency ratio, but the dependency ratio is the youth, right? So it's got a high youth dependency ratio. That's the description. And then so you're describing the shape. And then you might say something like, whereas the dependency ratio of Japan is the exact opposite because the bars are very different. In fact, Japan has a dependency ratio, a high dependency ratio of elderly in their country. Okay, done. That's good. That's really all you need to do for that one. All right. 1D, 2 more laps. Describe a relevant characteristic, concept, process, model, or theory in a specified context. Now, if you're looking at this and be like, wait a minute, didn't we just talk about describe? Yes, but this is where you're going to get your real world example. So think of this as being able to describe a geographic concept, but in a particular context. So not only are you going to describe the actual process, and actually this is like when I look at this and I see this skill, a lot of times when I have you do real world application, this is what I'm having you do. I'm having you apply what you've learned in this class to describe how that relates to whatever the real world concept is. So we've actually practiced this skill quite a bit, and you will practice this skill continually over the next 5 weeks. So not only are you describing the geography, but you're also using context to elaborate on your description. So for example, maybe you're describing the concept of contagious diffusion of slang, right? So like you have to understand what contagious diffusion is. So you're not just describing what contagious diffusion is, which you will have to do in your answer, but you're applying it to slang. And I feel like we practice this a lot too, because I'm always like, teenage translator, please. I'm not really sure what you're saying here. So you guys are kind of talking a little differently than me. And if we were going to like move this to a higher level of thinking, I might even ask you to then explain the consequences of the generational differences of slang use or something like that. Describe the process of migration from New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. So you're going to talk about migration, obviously, but you're going to apply it to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. So you'd probably talk about how the places that were most impacted were places where minorities lived, and a lot of those minorities were permanently displaced. So essentially, they were becoming internationally displaced people because they were moving. Chances are they were moving in one of two places, either where they had family or to a city in order to find a job. So all of that would be like a describe as it relates to a concept. Real world example. Describe commuting patterns in your city according to the gravity model. You kind of get the gist. Okay, last one. Explain the strengths and weaknesses and limitations of different geographic models and theories in a specified context. So this is the unicorn point. We talked about this already. This is like taking explain and making it just a little bit harder for you. So this is a skill that enables you to show off how studying geography has helped you to think critically about various models and theories. So it's not just about knowing the models, but it's being able to evaluate the models as well. The strengths of a model or theory are its enduring validity. It's the reason why we still talk about von Thunen, even though it was created in the 1800s. So when we think about von Thunen from our 21st perspective, how is this model still relevant? How is it not relevant? What are the limitations of the model that the creator didn't or couldn't consider at the time the model was created? We could do this for Weber too, but Weber is not probably going to be assessed in this particular AP test because it's a unit 7 concept. So von Thunen was the one that I was actually thinking about. So we'll just roll with that one. So what are 3 strengths? Or it wouldn't actually be written like that in the FRQ. It might be like explain a strength of the von Thunen model of agricultural land use. In other words, how is von Thunen's model still relevant to people living in the 21st century? Well, I think when you think about perishable goods, and even though we are living in a world where even food is part of the supply chain, it's still globalized, and chances are we're going to get our fresh fruits and vegetables during the winter from Central America. We're not going to get that stuff from Australia because that's just too far to travel for fresh fruits and vegetables. So there is an element, even though the rings, and this would be one of the weaknesses, even though the rings have gotten super, super wide because transportation has gotten so much better, you still have the von Thunen model sort of making sense when you think about those rings. Of course, one of the biggest limitations or weaknesses is that, that second ring of timber is no longer relevant at all because we've gotten better fuel since people use wood as fuel. So you kind of get the gist. And in order to effectively explain the strengths and weaknesses, again, this is almost like explain and compare at the same time. So when you're like I've seen them written several different times. To what degree, or explain to what degree von Thunen is still relevant today. When you see something like that, you want to talk about like degrees. So here it is still relevant. Here it's not still relevant. So you're providing both the pros and the cons, the strengths and the weaknesses, the benefits of still including a model like this in an AP Hug class, but also the limitations of using a model like this or teaching a model like this. And so again, that's this explain the degree to which is the one that I really want you guys to make sure that you're thinking about. Now, if we were going to put it all together for skill one, I'm going to tell you right now that you're not going to have like a skill one FRQ. Both of those FRQs are going to assess multiple skills and multiple units, but this is a good example of just a skill one concept. So you can see that it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so maybe a 15-minute FRQ. So describe the dependency ratio. If I were writing this, I would probably say define the dependency ratio, but I didn't, I stole it. Explain the difference between an elderly dependency ratio and a youth dependency ratio. This is almost like a compare. So when you see something like this, you'll probably want to say something like, what are the needs of an elderly dependency ratio versus a youth dependency ratio? Maybe you can even throw like MDC, LDC in there, which is why, the Unit 7 concepts could easily show up in some of these questions. Compare the dependency ratios of Uganda and Japan. Now you're using the stimulus specifically for that letter. Describe how a high elderly dependency ratio can affect services in more developed countries. Notice you're just talking about more developed countries, so you might talk about the need for old folks home or more hospitals or geriatric needs, wheelchair production, not wheelchair, walker production, etc. And then it says, explain the limitations of using the dependency ratio to predict the level of economic development of a country. That's like kind of a tricky question, actually, because when you think about the dependency ratio, particularly when it comes to China, remember that China, if you're thinking about DTM and economic development at the same time, China would be found in stage 3 of the DTM, moving into stage 4, I guess, but not quite there yet. Because of the economic inequality within the country, but it is clearly an aging population. So like a stage 5 country like Japan, but it's not stage 5, it's not most economically developed, so you can kind of get the All right, you guys, I hope that this was helpful. If you have questions, just jot them down and bring them to our Zoom meeting. But I hope you'll have a really good week. Or if you're watching this at the end of the week, I hope you have a good weekend. Bye.